Kicking off our list at number 1 is the case of Jeffrey Wisey at Red Lake High School. The tragic story began on a chilly March afternoon back in 2005, unfolding on a peaceful Native American reservation in Minnesota. Nobody could have predicted that in just a matter of minutes, a small high school in Red Lake would become the site of one of the most devastating school tragedies in recent American history, an event that would ultimately reveal deep fractures in local policing, emergency response protocols, and mental health support systems on tribal lands. Jeffrey Wise was only 16 years old. Following the loss of both his parents at a young age, he was living with his grandfather, who served as an officer with the tribal police. His father had passed away years before, and his mother was left with severe disabilities from a car accident. Those who knew him described him as a quiet kid, isolated and frequently a target of bullying. His teachers remembered a teenager who almost never spoke unless addressed directly, someone who always seemed to be on the periphery of every social setting. He dedicated countless hours to being online, where he posted bleak messages and drawings that suggested a deep sense of despair and emotional detachment. Despite these signs, no formal intervention ever took place. On the reservation, the resources for mental health services and school safety were already spread dangerously thin. On March 21, 2005, shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, Wise first made his way to his grandfather's house. The events that unfolded there were swift and absolutely catastrophic. His grandfather, the very tribal police sergeant he resided with, and his grandfather's partner were both lost at the home. Wise then took his grandfather's service weapon. He lived with his grandfather. He then breached the building, making his way through the hallways and into a classroom. Survivors would later recount the sheer panic that erupted, with desks being flipped over, windows shattering, and alarms screaming as students and staff scrambled for cover in a matter of minutes. During the chaos, several students and a teacher were fatally wounded, while many others sustained injuries. The rampage finally came to an end when tribal police officers stormed the building. As law enforcement closed in, Wise took his own life. In total, 9 individuals lost their lives before the ordeal was over. His grandfather, his grandfather's partner, a security guard, a teacher, and 5 students, before he turned the weapon on himself. This incident stands out as one of the rare school tragedies to occur on sovereign, tribal land, a fact that immediately created jurisdictional confusion among responding agencies. The question became, who was in charge? Was it the tribal police, the FBI, local sheriff's department, or other federal authorities? The subsequent investigation revealed that numerous warning signs had been missed. Wise had posted online about extremist ideologies, his struggles with depression, and a profound sense of disconnection from the world. Some students even claimed to have heard rumors circulating days before the attack, but the school lacked any structured threat assessment system. The school's security officer, while on duty, was not armed, and the tribal police force had not received any active incident response training at that time. Consequently, many officers waited outside, initially uncertain about whether to breach the school or hold their position for backup, a delay that would later draw significant criticism. Given that the event transpired on federal tribal land, the FBI ultimately assumed lead control of the investigation. Agents meticulously combed through Wise's computer, school assignments, and personal journals. The chairman of the Red Lake Tribal Council stated publicly that the tragedy represented not just an attack on their school, but a catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect Native communities. Since Wise did not survive the encounter with law enforcement, there was no trial. However, the aftermath of the tragedy sparked significant policy changes. Tribal schools throughout the United States began to receive federal funding for active response drills, threat assessment training, and expanded counseling services. The Bureau of Indian Affairs also issued new guidelines, mandating armed security personnel on campus and establishing direct lines of communication between tribal police, the FBI, and local emergency response teams. The event served as a catalyst for modernizing tribal law enforcement tactics, particularly in rural and isolated communities. Today, a memorial for the victims stands at Red Lake High School, which is now protected by a fully trained security team. Moreover, tribal police now conduct joint training exercises for active incident response with state and federal agencies, a direct result of the lessons learned from that terrible day. To an outsider, it may have seemed like just another school tragedy, but for many, it exposed something far deeper. It laid bare the devastating consequences of silence, isolation, and a lack of preparedness, ultimately marking the dawn of a new era in tribal community safety, in the way tribal schools and their police forces handle threats. Next, we examine a case that sent shockwaves through a completely different kind of community, a peaceful Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. At number 2, the tragic events at an Amish schoolhouse involving Charles Carl Roberts. It was set to be just another ordinary autumn morning in one of the most serene places in America, rural Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The Amish community there lived a simple life, without electricity, cars, or other modern distractions. Yet on October 2nd, 2006, violence shattered their world in the most unimaginable way inside a one-room schoolhouse known as West Nickel Mines. Charles Carl Roberts IV was a 32-year-old milk truck driver and a father of three. On the surface, he appeared to be a calm, responsible, and devoted family man, but privately, he was wrestling with heavy emotional burdens and a long-standing grief. Years earlier, his first child had passed away shortly after birth. He confided in his wife that he was battling guilt, anger, and intrusive thoughts he couldn't control. But he had no criminal history, no police record, and no one believed he was capable of harming a soul. Shortly after 10 in the morning, Roberts entered the Amish schoolhouse, equipped with a handgun, a shotgun, ammunition, and improvised restraints. He ordered the teacher and the boys to leave, keeping only the female students, girls aged 6 to 13, inside. He barricaded the doors using wooden boards and nearby desks. Someone outside called 911, and police arrived within minutes, but they faced a harrowing dilemma. This was a hostage situation, and the man inside was heavily armed with children in the room. Roberts made brief contact with police but refused to surrender. Negotiators attempted to speak with him, but he offered only short, eerily calm responses. Suddenly, without warning, he opened fire on the young hostages. As police forced their way inside, Roberts turned the weapon on himself, ending the violence in a matter of seconds. 5 girls died, and 5 others were critically injured but survived. The entire attack lasted less than 1 hour. But its impact echoed far beyond that schoolhouse. Because this was a peaceful Amish community that traditionally rejected modern law enforcement and had no school security measures, the tragedy captured the nation's attention. Investigators searched Roberts' home and found notes expressing remorse and unresolved pain, but no clear plan beyond that day. There was no criminal trial, as Roberts had perished at the scene. But the legal and tactical conversation immediately shifted to prevention and response. The state of Pennsylvania reviewed its policies for rural school safety, and police departments across the country studied the case as a stark example of how hostage situations can rapidly escalate into active attacker incidents. This resulted in new training for officers, focusing on immediate breach tactics, rapid decision-making, and blended protocols for hostage active shooter scenarios. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the story, however, came afterward from the Amish community itself. Within days, members of the community visited Roberts' family to offer forgiveness. They attended his funeral. They explained that anger would only deepen the pain. This response of pure grace astonished the nation and became a central part of how the story was remembered. The attack prompted major reforms in how rural schools coordinate with law enforcement. Schools, even in remote or religious communities, were encouraged to adopt silent alert systems, evacuation plans, and trauma counseling resources. It also helped shape modern negotiation strategy, emphasizing faster action when children are in immediate danger. Today, a small memorial stands where the school once stood. The building was torn down and replaced with an open field. The survivors grew up, some speaking about their healing, while others have chosen silence. But law enforcement agencies still study the case, not for its brutality, but for the crucial lessons it taught about speed, communication, and compassion in the aftermath. Coming up next is a university tragedy that forced colleges across America to rethink how fast police notify and respond to campus threats. At number 3, Stephen Kazmierczak and the Northern Illinois University incident. On February 14, 2008, students gathered inside Cole Hall at Northern Illinois University for what they thought would be just another afternoon lecture. Their minds were on upcoming exams and weekend plans, completely unaware that in a matter of minutes, their campus would be at the heart of a nationwide debate. A debate about police response times and emergency alerts on college campuses. The man responsible was 27-year-old Stephen Kazmierczak. He was a former honor student at NIU with a major in sociology, and his professors remembered him as intelligent, quiet, and well-mannered. In fact, he had received an award for academic excellence just 2 years prior, but his life began to fall apart after he left the university and stopped taking his prescribed medication for mental health challenges. His friends observed him growing more isolated and erratic, but none of them foresaw the imminent danger. A little after 3 in the afternoon, Kazmierczak arrived on campus, dressed in dark clothes and carrying several firearms hidden inside a guitar case. He then made his way into a large lecture hall, which was packed with students in an introductory geology class. Without a single word, he began discharging his weapons at the front of the room and throughout the space. Chaos erupted immediately. Students dove for cover behind seats, while others shattered windows to get out. A call to 911 was placed within seconds. Fortunately, police were already close by. Learning from previous campus tragedies like the one at Virginia Tech, NIU had specifically trained its officers for rapid response. In approximately 6 minutes, campus police were at the building, but at the very moment they breached the lecture hall, the sound of shots ceased. Kazmierczak had ended his own life at the front of the room. The attack left 5 students dead and more than a dozen others injured. The subsequent investigation uncovered that Kazmierczak had acquired all of his firearms legally, having successfully passed all required background checks. He possessed no criminal record or any official history that would have prohibited him from owning weapons. Investigators also learned he had mailed a package on the morning of the incident to a former girlfriend, which contained a farewell note and some personal belongings. But what truly set this case apart wasn't just the tragic toll on its victims, but the profound way it reshaped campus safety protocols nationwide. This tragedy brought a critical failure from the Virginia Tech incident a year earlier into sharp focus. Students there had not been warned of the danger until it was far too late. In contrast, at NIU, the police and university administration broadcast a campus-wide alert just minutes after the initial 911 call, rapidly deploying text messages, emails, and website notifications. These alerts urged everyone to either take shelter or evacuate the area. Yet, as swift as this response was, it couldn't prevent the loss of life inside Cole Hall. This outcome spurred lawmakers to champion legislation for mandatory emergency communication systems at all colleges that receive federal funding. In response, universities started installing panic buttons in classrooms, upgrading door locks, and running active threat drills in coordination with campus police and local law enforcement agencies. This helped formalize a new protocol where police would no longer wait for backup, but would instead enter immediately to neutralize the threat. While there was no trial or sentencing, the incident's impact on law and procedure was immense. Later in 2008, Congress moved to strengthen the Clery Act, which mandates that universities issue timely warnings during on-campus emergencies. Schools were also newly required to create and maintain written emergency response plans and to conduct regular training exercises. Today, a memorial garden sits beside the rebuilt Cole Hall, a tribute honoring the 5 students who lost their lives: Gail Dubowski, Catalina Garcia, Juliana Gahan, Ryan Mace, and Daniel Parmenter. Their names are now forever linked to the sweeping changes in how universities approach the protection of their students. The incident at NIU is remembered not just for the lives that were taken, but for the critical safety systems it fundamentally transformed. It compelled educational institutions to confront a difficult question: how quickly can you alert thousands of people when a few seconds can mean the difference between life and death? Coming up next, we examine a case that unfolded not in a school, but inside a government building where a man entered a city council meeting and began his attack. Case number 4, the Kirkwood City Hall incident involving Charles Cookie Thornton. It all began on a quiet February evening in Kirkwood, Missouri. Inside City Hall, a local council meeting was in session, a scene that was, up to that point, entirely routine and calm. It was the typical kind of public meeting where residents would debate things like zoning permits and budgets, but on February 7, 2008, that meeting was shattered in a way nobody could have ever predicted. A man entered the building armed with a handgun and began shooting at elected officials, police officers, and city employees. This incident marked one of the first modern attacks on a government building while it was in session, and it fundamentally changed how public offices all over America handled security. The gunman was identified as Charles Cookie Thornton, a 52-year-old man who had lived in Kirkwood his entire life and was once a familiar face in the community. He worked as a construction contractor and had even been a firefighter. But over time, his relationship with city officials grew increasingly tense and hostile. His construction company had been hit with dozens of citations for building code violations and for operating without the proper permits, leading Thornton to become a regular at city council meetings. There, he would accuse city leaders of singling him out unfairly, becoming so disruptive that he had to be escorted out of meetings on several occasions. In 2007, things escalated to the point where he was arrested for disorderly conduct during a public session, signaling that what started as a civil dispute was taking a much darker turn. On the night of the attack, at around 7 p.m., Thornton parked his vehicle near City Hall. He then walked inside, armed with 2 handguns and extra ammunition, and immediately shot and killed a police officer stationed in the lobby. Thornton then took the fallen officer's weapon, reloaded his own, and proceeded directly into the council chamber. The meeting inside was being recorded and broadcast live on local television when Thornton burst in, shouting anti-government slogans before opening fire on the council members and city staff. Mayor Mike Swoboda was critically wounded, while 2 council members and a public works employee were killed on the spot. A second officer, hearing the shots, rushed in. That officer was shot while trying to intervene. Moments later, more police flooded the chamber, confronting Thornton and fatally shooting him before he had a chance to move into other parts of the building. The entire assault was over in a matter of minutes, but it left a devastating toll. 6 people were dead, including Thornton himself, and the community was left completely stunned. The subsequent investigation confirmed that Thornton had acted alone, and he had left behind written documents. In these notes, he expressed his rage towards city officials and claimed he was a victim of unfair treatment, but investigators found no evidence of a wider plot or any accomplices. Since the attacker was deceased, there was no trial, but the incident sparked a serious, nationwide conversation about security protocols in public government buildings. At that time, most city halls didn't have metal detectors, armed guards, or any kind of emergency lockdown procedures, as council meetings were seen as safe, open community gatherings. They were places the public could enter with very little screening at the door. After the Kirkwood shooting, that changed almost overnight, with municipal buildings across the country starting to install metal detectors. They also added panic buttons, stationed armed officers at public meetings, and implemented new standards like glass barriers, secure entry points, and regular evacuation drills in towns and cities everywhere. Although Mayor Swoboda survived the initial shooting, he passed away several months later from complications related to his injuries. His death only intensified the push for changes in how local governments protect their public servants and citizens. Today, the Kirkwood shooting is studied not just as a tragedy, but as a pivotal moment that revealed even small-town government institutions were vulnerable to targeted violence, and it completely reshaped the way police departments coordinate with local governments to provide effective on-site security. Coming up next is a case involving an attack on immigrants at a community center, where language barriers and communication delays would ultimately change how 911 systems operate across the country. At number 5, the Javerly Wong Binghamton Immigration Center shooting on April 3, 2009. What began as a quiet morning at the American Civic Association in Binghamton, New York, quickly spiraled into a national tragedy. This building served as a vital hub where immigrants came to study English, prepare for their citizenship tests, and get help building a new life. On that particular morning, over 40 people were gathered in classrooms when a man armed with 2 handguns walked in and began shooting. The events that unfolded next would expose a critical flaw in our emergency communication systems, particularly when language barriers get in the way between victims and first responders. The shooter was identified as 41-year-old Javerly Wong, an immigrant from Vietnam who had been living in the United States for almost 2 decades. He had previously held jobs in manufacturing and as a delivery driver, but in the years leading up to the incident, he grew more and more withdrawn. According to friends, he felt deeply shamed by losing his job and had a hard time with English, even though he was taking language classes at that very center, and he was convinced that people made fun of the way he spoke. He legally possessed weapons and was a regular at local shooting ranges, but he had no significant criminal history. Around 10 in the morning, Wong positioned his car against the building's back exit, intentionally blocking the door to prevent any escape. He then walked into the lobby and immediately targeted 2 receptionists. One of them did not survive. The other, despite being severely wounded, played dead and discreetly dialed 911, making her the first person to alert the authorities. Inside the classrooms, scores of students froze in place, took cover in closets, or dropped to the floor. A large number of them had limited English proficiency, which made it nearly impossible for them to call for help. Police were on the scene within minutes, but this is where a crucial breakdown occurred. Law enforcement believed the threat was ongoing and that Wong might have taken people captive. This led them to delay making a tactical entry into the building. Lacking a clear picture of what was happening inside, SWAT teams established a perimeter around the building as negotiators tried to establish communication. But on the inside, Wong had already ended his own life. For a full 40 minutes, no one went in. Those who were injured were left without medical attention because the police were unsure if the assailant was still a threat. By the time officers finally made their way inside, the final count was 13 lives lost, including the perpetrator, and 4 others were wounded. Investigators would later uncover a letter Wong had sent to a local news station, which laid out his feelings of bitterness and despair. In it, he wrote that he felt like he didn't exist in the very country he had hoped would offer him a new beginning. Since this event unfolded at a multicultural center, the majority of those affected were newcomers to the country, hailing from places like China, Haiti, and Pakistan, as well as Iraq, Brazil, and the Philippines. During the ordeal, many were unable to communicate with 911 or the police, Some remained in hiding for hours, even after law enforcement was on site, because they couldn't comprehend the English commands that SWAT teams were shouting. The aftermath of this event triggered significant changes in policy. Emergency dispatch centers throughout the United States were mandated to improve their access to on-demand translation services. Police departments revised their protocols for active threat situations. The new guideline states that even if the sound of gunfire stops, officers must still make a swift entry to save more lives. The delay in Binghamton became a textbook case of how hesitation can have fatal consequences. While there was no trial, the legal repercussions were substantial. New York State overhauled its procedures for managing emergencies involving multiple languages. At the federal level, local agencies were urged to provide training for their officers on how to interact with individuals who don't speak English in high-stress scenarios. Additionally, the American Civic Association received funds to help it rebuild and provide crucial mental health services to the survivors. Today, a memorial stands outside the center, bearing the names of the 12 individuals who were lost. The building is now equipped with upgraded security systems, improved emergency exits, and has cultivated a stronger partnership with local police to ensure a quicker response time. The incident in Binghamton was a story not just of aggression, but of silence, the voices that were unable to ask for help, and the officers who paused because they lacked situational awareness. It fundamentally shifted the national conversation around crisis communication. Coming up next, a tragic event at a Texas school that redefined classroom safety protocols, introducing a new expectation that teachers, not just law enforcement, could be a first line of defense. At number 6, we have the case of Dimitrios Pagortzis and the Santa Fe High School incident on May 18, 2018. The day at Santa Fe High School in Texas started out completely normal. Students were making their way through the hallways, talking with friends, with no idea that in just a few minutes, their campus would become the focal point of a nationwide discussion, not only about these kinds of events, but also about the controversial topic of arming teachers and school staff and the proper speed for schools to notify police during an active situation. The individual responsible was 17-year-old Dimitrios Pagortzis, who was a junior there. He didn't fit the typical profile of a social outcast. He was a player on the school's football team, from a blue-collar family with a clean record, but his classmates saw him as a loner with a quiet, brewing rage. In the weeks leading up to the tragic event, he shared pictures online of a long coat adorned with symbols and a shirt that declared, "Born to Kill." Hardly anyone took these posts seriously. Then, at about 7:30 in the morning, Pagortzis walked into the school carrying a shotgun and a revolver, both of which legally belonged to his parents. He entered an art classroom and opened fire. In an instant, students and teachers were scrambling for cover behind tables and counters. Some students shattered windows to get out, fire alarms blared, and kids poured into the hallways, completely unaware that this was not a drill. Law enforcement was already close by, a direct result of lessons learned from past school tragedies. Santa Fe police and school resource officers confronted the gunman within just 4 minutes. Pagortzis traded gunfire with them before falling back into a classroom storage area, where he held out for over 20 minutes before giving himself up. The toll was devastating. 10 people lost their lives, 8 students and 2 teachers, and another 13 were wounded. In the course of the investigation, authorities discovered homemade explosive devices on school grounds and at Pagortzis' residence, indicating the attack had been planned for a while. He revealed to police that he intentionally spared certain students he liked, claiming he wanted his story to be told, not to end. From a legal standpoint, he faced charges of capital murder and aggravated assault on a public servant. However, being under the age of 18 made him ineligible for the death penalty. His court proceedings hit repeated delays after he was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial. To this day, he is housed in a secure mental health facility, with his trial still a pending possibility. This horrific event triggered a massive overhaul of school safety protocols in Texas. Unlike past tragedies, the police response was swift, but even that speed couldn't prevent the loss of life. In reaction, Texas legislators established the Guardian program, which permits trained teachers and school staff to carry firearms on campus. Schools statewide were mandated to install panic alert systems, fortify classroom doors, and run regular lockdown drills. The state also required every school district to form a threat assessment team tasked with identifying students who exhibit warning signs. On a national level, the Santa Fe tragedy changed the conversation from "how did police respond?" to "should schools be able to defend themselves before police get there?" It highlighted the reality that rural schools could face longer waits for backup, and that communication between school staff and law enforcement had to be instantaneous. Today, the school has been updated with new fencing, camera systems, and a redesigned layout to minimize entry points. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued to demand accountability, not just from the attacker, but from the systems that failed to see the danger signs. The tragedy at Santa Fe High School left a painful and lasting legacy, but it fundamentally reshaped school security across Texas. It served as a stark reminder to the nation that even with a rapid police response, the preparedness inside the school itself can be the difference between life and death. Next up is a case where the targets weren't students or officials, but journalists, an assault inside a newsroom that transformed how media outlets handle threats and coordinate police protection. Number 7. Jared Ramos and the Capital Gazette newsroom shooting. On June 28, 2018, the journalists at the Capital Gazette newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland, were going about their daily routine, editing stories, checking headlines, and racing against deadlines. Their office was a small, quiet space, completely open to the public. There were no security guards, no metal detectors, and no panic buttons. That afternoon, a man armed with a shotgun walked right through the front doors. In less than 60 seconds, everything changed, not just for that newsroom, but for how police and media organizations nationwide would prepare for danger from that day forward. The man behind the attack was 38-year-old Jared Ramos. Years before, the newspaper had run a story covering a harassment case against him. Ramos filed a defamation lawsuit against the paper, but a judge threw it out, ruling that all the reported information was factual. From that moment on, Ramos developed an obsession with the newspaper and its employees. He began sending furious emails, posting threats online, and lodging repeated complaints with the courts and the police. However, since he had never become physically violent, the authorities claimed their hands were tied. On that summer afternoon, Ramos walked into the Gazette building shortly after 2:30 p.m. He had meticulously planned the assault, even barricading the back exit to prevent anyone from escaping. He then entered the open-plan newsroom and started shooting. Reporters scrambled for cover under their desks, some desperately texting loved ones, while others dialed 911. In about 60 seconds from the first gunshot, police received the call. This response, unlike in older incidents like Binghamton or Columbine, the officers didn't hesitate. They were inside the building within 2 minutes, advancing toward the sound of the gunfire. Ramos was discovered hiding beneath a desk and gave himself up without a fight. 5 of the newspaper's employees lost their lives: Gerald Fishman, Rob Hiason, John McNamara, Rebecca Smith, and Wendy Winters. In the wake of the tragedy, urgent questions arose. Why wasn't the newspaper's office secured, especially after years of documented threats? Journalists admitted they had felt vulnerable for a long time, yet most newsrooms across America had minimal to no physical security. Investigators discovered that Ramos had spent years plotting the attack. He had even removed his own fingerprints to avoid being identified and had altered his weapons to hinder ballistic tracing. However, he had no escape plan. His goal was to make a statement, not to get away. Ramos was subsequently charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. In 2021, a jury dismissed his insanity defense, finding him criminally responsible for his actions. He was later handed multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. This horrific attack forced newsrooms all over the country to face a harsh new reality. Journalists were now seen as potential targets. Security protocols were overhauled almost overnight, with many newspapers installing locked entry doors, panic alarms, bullet-resistant glass, and mandatory visitor check-ins. Police departments also updated their active shooter training to specifically cover media offices, acknowledging them as high-risk locations, especially during times of public controversy or political tension. In the face of this tragedy, the Capital Gazette staff did something truly remarkable. They managed to publish the next day's paper. On the front page, right below the masthead, a single line read, "Tomorrow, this newspaper will publish." It became a powerful symbol of resilience. Today, the building where the attack took place has much tighter security, but the desks of the 5 victims have been left as memorials. The Capital Gazette case did more than just change how newsrooms approach safety. It served as a stark reminder to the world that threats, even those that are ignored or dismissed, can escalate into deadly violence. Coming up next is a case out of Florida, where a peaceful yoga studio became the scene of a targeted attack and exposed critical failures in recognizing the warning signs of a violent ideology. Number 8. The Scott Bierl, Tallahassee Hot Yoga Studio shooting. On November 2, 2018, a tranquil yoga class was in session on the second floor of a small studio in Tallahassee, Florida. Soft music was playing, and the lights were dimmed as people stretched in silence. Then, suddenly, a man armed with a handgun walked in. The horror that unfolded next lasted only a few minutes, but it would force law enforcement to confront a new type of threat, one fueled by resentment, ideology, and a series of warning signs that were seen but ultimately ignored. The attacker was identified as 40-year-old Scott Paul Beerle. He had a documented history of disturbing behavior, which included multiple harassment complaints and past arrests for inappropriate conduct. Yet none of these incidents ever led to serious charges or prison time. On his social media accounts, he would post videos seething with rage toward women and expressing admiration for previous attackers who held similar beliefs. He was part of a growing online subculture where personal frustration and extremism merged into violent fantasies. However, at the time, this particular ideology wasn't widely recognized as a threat by law enforcement. At around 5:30 in the evening, Beerle entered Hot Yoga Tallahassee, posing as a customer. Just moments later, he pulled out a handgun and began shooting at the people inside the studio. Some people tried to flee, while others bravely fought back. One man charged at him and was shot as he attempted to disarm the gunman. Within minutes, multiple emergency calls flooded into the police department. Officers arriving on the scene heard the final gunshot. Beerle had turned the gun on himself before they could make entry. 2 women lost their lives in the attack, and several other people were injured. The people he targeted included a college student and a medical school researcher. With no trial or interrogation possible, investigators quickly uncovered his YouTube videos and online posts, where Beerle laid out his beliefs in no uncertain terms. He blamed women for his own shortcomings, celebrated previous attackers, and argued that his violence was justified. This case marked a major turning point for threat assessment in the United States. Unlike earlier attacks driven by revenge or personal grudges, this one was rooted in ideology. It forced police and federal agencies to start recognizing and tracking patterns of violence linked to deep-seated hatred of women and extremist online groups. Law enforcement started classifying this threat as gender-based violent extremism. But there were other systemic failures as well. Beerle had been reported on multiple occasions for disturbing behavior, including physically accosting women in public, but because charges were frequently dropped and he was never convicted of a major crime, he was able to legally own firearms. This incident sparked new national conversations about red flag laws, measures that allow police to temporarily confiscate weapons from individuals who exhibit violent warning signs. In response, Florida implemented more robust threat assessment teams at universities and in workplaces, mandating that they coordinate directly with law enforcement if someone displayed escalating behavior. Yoga studios, fitness centers, churches, and other public community spaces began conducting active threat drills, something that was once unthinkable. Survivors later spoke out publicly about the incredible bravery shown inside that room. Some pretended to be dead, while others helped fellow students escape through side exits. One woman even used her own body to shield a friend. In the following days, the studio was filled with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. It became painfully clear that this tragedy wasn't just about one disturbed individual, but about a system that had recognized the warning signs and still failed to intervene. Today, the yoga studio is back open with upgraded security, and law enforcement agencies in Florida now use the Tallahassee case as a key example in training seminars, focusing on early intervention, ideologically motivated violence, and the dangers of inaction. Next up is an attack inside a government office that took place in 2019, where a long-term employee suddenly turned on his colleagues, prompting new security regulations for municipal buildings. Number 9. Duane Craddock and the Virginia Beach Municipal Building Shooting. May 31st, 2019 started out like any other workday. At the Virginia Beach Municipal Center in Virginia, employees in the public utilities, planning, and city administration departments were just going about their daily routines. But by the end of the afternoon, that building would become the site of one of the deadliest municipal office attacks in American history, forcing cities all across the country to completely rethink how government workplaces are secured. The attacker was a 40-year-old man named Duane Craddock, a certified engineer who had been an employee of the city's public utilities department for almost 15 years. He had no criminal record and no history of violence, and his colleagues described him as quiet but polite. However, in the weeks leading up to the attack, Craddock put in his resignation. A few coworkers noticed he seemed withdrawn and on edge. What nobody knew was that he was already in the process of planning the assault. At around 4 p.m., inside Building 2 of the Municipal Center, Craddock used his employee keycard to get into secure areas of the building. As staff members were finishing up their workday, he was carrying 2 legally purchased handguns, both outfitted with extended magazines and a suppressor. Without any warning, he started shooting in the office hallways and inside individual workspaces. Employees frantically dialed 911, barricading doors or hiding inside closets. The police received the first emergency call just minutes later. Officers were already in the vicinity and entered the building quickly, following modern active shooter protocol, but the building's layout, with its multiple hallways, closed-off rooms, and keycard-only sections, made finding the attacker incredibly difficult. Gunfire echoed between floors, and visibility was poor. Craddock made his way through the building, firing at anyone he came across. After nearly 36 minutes, police finally located him on the second floor. A fierce gunfight erupted between Craddock and the officers. He was critically wounded in the exchange of fire and later died at the hospital. In the end, 12 people were killed and 4 others were seriously injured. Every single victim was either a city employee or a contractor working within that building. The subsequent investigation uncovered that Craddock had acquired his firearms through legal channels. He left no record of threats, issued no direct warnings to police, and had no clear manifesto, which made this one of the most difficult kinds of cases to foresee an act of violence from a trusted insider. Since a trial was impossible, the focus shifted entirely to prevention. Both local and federal agencies began studying how a supposedly secure municipal building, staffed by individuals with police training, could fall victim to such a devastating breach. The attack prompted immediate and sweeping changes. Across multiple states, metal detectors and armed security became standard in government buildings. Employee keycard access systems were completely overhauled to allow police to override locked doors during an emergency. Panic buttons and silent alarm applications were installed on office computers and employee phones. Cities also rolled out threat assessment programs designed to identify employees exhibiting signs of severe stress or instability. Meanwhile, the victims' families criticized the city for its outdated floor plans and a critical lack of internal communication as the attack unfolded. In response, the state of Virginia passed legislation mandating that government offices develop comprehensive emergency response plans, conduct active threat drills, and guarantee real-time coordination between building security and police dispatch. Today, a memorial stands just outside the building, engraved with the names of the 12 individuals who lost their lives. City officials made a solemn vow to never resume operations in the very rooms where the tragedy occurred, as a sign of respect for the victims. What made this case particularly chilling was just how ordinary everything appeared right before it all began. There was no manifesto, no public threats, just a long-term employee who, one day, walked into his job and never walked out. The event demonstrated to law enforcement that even the most secure workplaces can become targets from the inside, and that preparedness has to extend far beyond just external threats. Next up is our final case, number 10. Samuel Cassidy and the San Jose VTA rail yard shooting, May 26, 2021, started out like any other morning at the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority rail yard in San Jose, California. Mechanics, controllers, and engineers were arriving before sunrise to prepare the trains for daily service. But just after 6 a.m., the routine of the workplace shattered, becoming the scene of a terrible tragedy that would expose just how unprepared various law enforcement agencies were to coordinate with one another during an active threat scenario. The perpetrator was 57-year-old Samuel Cassidy, a maintenance technician who had been with the VTA for almost 20 years. He was known for being a quiet man who was easily irritated and frequently isolated himself from his colleagues. Some coworkers mentioned that he would hold grudges for years, yet he never made a threat that led to any serious disciplinary action. Unbeknownst to everyone around him, he had also been stockpiling firearms and ammunition at his home. On that particular morning, Cassidy set his own house ablaze and then drove to the rail yard, leaving the fire to spread in his wake. He used his employee badge to gain access to secure areas of the facility, carrying handguns and several loaded magazines, completely undetected. He then began his assault, targeting his coworkers across 2 separate buildings. Some of the victims were confronted at close range, while others were caught as they tried to flee. Absolute chaos erupted throughout the workplace. People scrambled to hide under desks, barricaded themselves in rooms, and made frantic calls to their loved ones. Officers from several different police departments arrived on the scene within minutes. But because the attack was happening inside a government facility with restricted access, some officers were unable to immediately get inside certain buildings without the proper security cards. To make matters worse, different agencies were operating on separate radio channels, which meant that not everyone on site could communicate with each other clearly. By the time officers managed to push deeper into the facility, Cassidy had already taken his own life. 9 VTA employees lost their lives. The subsequent investigation confirmed that Cassidy had purchased his weapons legally. Inside his burned-out home, authorities discovered a cache of ammunition, paperwork indicating financial frustration, and notes that expressed deep-seated anger toward his coworkers. In the end, there was no criminal trial, no confession in a courtroom, only his final actions and the devastating questions they left in their wake. What followed was a major shift in how cities all across the United States would prepare for the possibility of violence in municipal workplaces. Officials came to the stark realization that even when police respond quickly, a lack of interagency communication can cost lives. In response, law enforcement throughout Santa Clara County started operating on unified emergency radio networks, while floor plans for critical facilities were digitized and provided to police and fire departments to help officers navigate more swiftly during a crisis. City buildings also began installing upgraded badge systems that gave police the ability to override locked doors during an emergency. Some cities started requiring employees to undergo active threat training, as workplaces formed behavioral threat assessment teams to identify and report troubling behavior before it could escalate into violence. The victims' families urged lawmakers to take action, arguing that people deserve to feel safe when going to work in a public building. California's legislature responded by passing new workplace safety standards and mandating the creation of emergency response plans in all state-run offices. A permanent memorial now stands outside the rail yard, honoring the employees whose lives were taken. The buildings are still operational, but the culture of safety there has been forever altered. The San Jose VTA tragedy served as a powerful reminder that danger doesn't always come from outside a secure building. Sometimes it walks in wearing a badge, going unnoticed until it's far too late. And with that, we conclude our final case. 10 pivotal moments in modern history where failure sparked profound change, and where law enforcement had to confront that the systems meant to protect their communities were no longer adequate for the world we now inhabit.